Just gonna handle that for me because he's the best. Thank you, Taylor. If you see him, be sure to say thank you for me. So the reason I put this video clip up here, I know some of you might know me from Facebook and Instagram. Some of you might not know me. So if you don't know me, a little bit about me. So I'm originally from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, but I go to school over at UW La Crosse. So I am fortunate enough to have the opportunity to go all around the state fishing, doing what I love, telling people about fishing, and teaching them about things that I know. So one thing I'll bring right off the bat is that I am never going to be the guy who tells you, this is the only way to catch a bluegill, this is the best way, you need to do it. No, that's not what I'm about. What I'm about is, I went out on Lake Winnebago today, and I was in 3 feet of water, catching these fish, here's how I did it. I want to be very clear that I don't want to be the guy saying I know everything, because let's address the elephant in the room. I'm 20 years old, okay? So some of you have more than 20 years of fishing experience. I recognize that. I have maybe 5. But the reason the Expo brought me in today is because I'm all about, like I said, sharing about what I do and trying to be very transparent in the fact that I want everyone to catch fish. I love catching fish. That's why I'm here, like many of you. But I want more people to experience that. So I know the frustration that comes when you're out on the water saying, let's say it's bluegill, and you're trying to catch a bluegill. You're trying so hard. Trust me, there are days where it's slow for me too. And there's just some days where you just can't figure it out. So me, I'm very stubborn. You know, most people might not come to an expo like this and be very transparent like that. Oh, I'm stubborn. That's not something you usually want to say about yourself. But I say that because with fishing, I'm doing everything I can to catch a certain type of fish when I put my mind to it. So that's why I think I have the experience to tell you about how I do it. And that's how I have success. So we'll be done with this video of a muskie being released. So like I said, all about sharing info. That's what I love to do. Content creator, that's just a fancy way of saying I post on social media like many of you do. If you all wanted to call yourself content creators, you totally could. No offense taken. Published writer. If you want to read any of them, just give me a shout after the show. I've got articles about the Mississippi River, Lake Winnebago, all sorts of stuff from over the state. Fishing enthusiast. I can't hit on this enough because for me, fishing is not just something I like to do. Fishing is my blood, sweat, and tears are put into that every single day. It is all I think about. And if you aren't super stoked about fishing and you start talking to me about fishing, I'm sorry. Because you're probably gonna get sick of it real quick because I will go on for hours and hours and hours about how much I love fishing. But you'll learn that in the presentation here. So again, like I said, sharing info, but more importantly, I'm always learning. Like I said, 20 years old, I've been fishing for 5 years. I recognize that some of you in this room have been fishing for decades. You have way more experience than I do, and that's why I like to say I'm always learning. I'm always looking for more ways to catch different kinds of fish. I'm gonna get my little clicker here to make this a bit easier on me, that way I'm not running up to the stage and hitting buttons constantly. Oh, it works, perfect. So just a little bit about what I'm gonna tell you about today. So, some shallow water tactics that I like to use for all kinds of panfish, bluegill, crappie, perch, for those of you who don't know what a panfish are. So I have some bobber rigs, Ned rigs, which are an interesting one. If you bass fish, you know what a Ned rig is, but for pan fishing, you might not. Fly fishing as well is another tactic that I'll cover as well. Deep water jigging wraps, which actually is one of the things that you might have a chance at winning today. These things right here. I use those all the time in deep water, and I'll talk more about those later. Gosh, I already almost started telling you about it. I can't spoil that. The jigging spoons, same kind of deal, just a heavier bait to help you get down to deep water, and then bobber rigs as well, just a different style. So, and then I'll go over, I'm actually gonna give you some hot spots. Most people wouldn't do that. I'm trying to be good to you here. I'm trying to say, hey, if you've never fished Lake Winnebago and you've struggled, here's a spot to try. Here's what you should be looking for. So I'm gonna talk about lakes, rivers, hot spots on both of those, and some mapping tools that you may or not use, but I think you should. I'm not sponsored by them, I just think you should use them because they're very effective in what I'm trying to do. Shallow water, honestly, my favorite way to panfish. Deep water, it's fun, but really nothing takes you back to being a kid, even though I'm not that far from being a kid. Nothing takes you back to being a kid, like taking a bobber, maybe a worm, something like that, chucking out there, trying to catch a bluegill. I'm sure many of you have experienced that in your life. It's a blast. And some big crappie like that one. Biggest crappie I've ever caught. Absolute slab. I'm so proud of that. That's why I put it on here for you. Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure. I can't answer that in front of a crowd. So, to start with a bobber rig, so there's a few key components, and I'm going to talk about the components of the rig, but I like to say that it doesn't matter what you put on the end of your line if you don't use it properly in the right situation. So, to start off with, right at the top there's a bobber, and I'm actually going to get one of these out because that picture does not really effectively show you how small of a bobber I'm talking about. So we've all seen like the classic round red and white bobber, like we've all seen it before that everybody fishes with for bluegill, right? That's one option. Those are usually like yay big, probably about that big. I'm just gonna walk this around and show you because it's actually ridiculous how small this thing is. Look at this little thing, take a good look. Tiny, tiny, tiny bobber. Now it is bright neon because it is so tiny. You know, I've got decent eyes. I wear contacts, so you know I kind of need some help there. But it's really hard to see this thing, especially if you cast it pretty far away from you. Just gonna keep doing this awkward walk around the room. Take a look. Super tiny bobber. And if you notice, I won't spoil it before I get over here. Gosh, didn't know they'd be having me doing cardio today. Take a look. Tiny, tiny bobber. Thank you again, Taylor. Hope you all are thanking Taylor and tipping him appropriately. Tiny, tiny bobber. See that? Tiny, tiny bobber. So if you notice, there's that little lead round thing on the bottom of the bobber. That's a little weight. So obviously, this bobber, it's not very heavy. It's pretty dang hard to cast. So that little weight on there helps with not only casting it far, but if you're using the jigs that I'm talking about, those 2 to 3 millimeter ice jigs, those things are tiny. I wish I had some with me because it is ridiculous how small they are. They're really light. So you need a bobber that has some weight on it. That way it'll sit there and that way it'll sit upright. Otherwise, if you have a really light jig on there, it'll just kind of like flop over and it's not gonna be clear when you have a bite. So going into rods quick, that's another important thing with this rigging. So I will mention too, 2 to 3 pound fluorocarbon leader after this swivel. So I have 10 pound braid rigged up on this rod. This is actually a walleye rod. It's not your typical 5-foot ugly stick that you see most people fishing with for bluegill. Nothing wrong with that. That was how I started bluegill fishing. But a rod like this, now let's get into science here. So it's just a bigger lever to throw your bait. It's not a 5-foot rod. This one's I think a 7'1". It's just more leverage you have to check out those little bobbers. So if you're gonna do this kind of tactic, I would highly, highly, highly recommend a longer rod. This one's a medium light. I would recommend like a lighter medium light. Once you get into medium, it's a lot harder to feel bites from bluegill and smaller fish like that. And then right on the end here, now full transparency, I have caught fish before on just a bare jig. It happens. Sometimes fish, like, there's days where you can't do anything right fishing, and you pound your head into the wall saying, what am I doing wrong? But then there's days where you say, I can't do anything wrong. I'm doing everything right. All I can do is catch fish. But when those days don't happen, which those don't happen that often, let's all be honest here. This little plastic guy here, it's such a small little plastic, but it has that little dangly tail on the back that even when that jig is sitting completely still in the water, that little thing just barely jiggling in front of their face. Bluegill, perch, crappie, they all love it. And I lost my clicker again. You guys gotta remind me when I just put things over there. Thank you, you're the best. So, before I get into that, any questions on bobbers? Because this is probably the one technique I get so many questions on in Lake Winnebago especially, because people are always saying, well, I'm using bobbers and I'm not catching bluegill, I'm using worms and I'm not catching bluegill, what are you doing differently? Any questions? Anybody? Oh, yeah.
Is that typically for shallow then? I mean, obviously you don't want to, what's your range before you switch it for deep water or you just put it deep?
Yeah, so the question was, is that just for deep, or just for shallow water, and like what's the range that I usually use it in? So like, when do I say, okay, this is too deep, now I'm gonna start using a different approach? Great question. That's something I've kind of learned through experience, that for the most part, this kind of rig, I'm only gonna be using this, I'd say at the most like 6 feet deep. Because once you get further than that, I mean, that bobber is awesome for really shallow water. Once you get deeper than 6 feet, that jig is just so far down from the bobber that even when you get a hit, it's like you barely see it in the bobber or you see it late. So I would say anywhere like shallower than 6 feet for the most part. And I'll get into some deeper bobber rigs later. This is just the shallow water bobber rig. So this one I want to touch on real quickly because I don't have a ton of experience in it. So Ned rigs are a bait that's very popular in the bass fishing world. Long story short, it's a jig head with a flat head on it. So when you cast it out, your plastic's gonna swing up when it hits the bottom. Looks a lot like a crayfish. Like if you've ever seen a crayfish swim in the water, they start on the bottom, they swim up, and then they glide down. So that jig head just helps it stand up on the bottom. And I've used these micro Ned rigs. I think Z-Man makes them, if you know that company. I haven't really seen them from anywhere else. These things are also, again, just a tiny version of a Ned rig. The 1/10 ounce is very effective for me. Anything lighter than that, and again, you get into the issue of like not really being able to feel it, or it takes forever to hit bottom. I am not the most patient fisherman, so I really hate it when I'm casting out and then saying, all right, am I on bottom yet? Nope. Am I on bottom yet? Nope. Okay. So I would say if you're gonna try that technique, I'd use 1/10 ounce. As you can see, if a bluegill, crappie, occasional pike, if you're a fan of those, it's amazing what they will hit. So fly fishing. I don't know how many of you, let's take a poll. How many of you have fly fished before in this room? Good amount. That's honestly more than I was expecting. So this right here is not even a like crazy fancy fly rod. It's like a Cabela's, I want to say it's like the cheapest fly rod they make, like a $100 combo or something. It's nothing special. The point about fly fishing though, is that especially on Lake Winnebago, how many of you have ever been there during the summer when there's lake flies? How many of you know what lake flies are? Again, also a good amount. Sweet. So if you don't know what that is, basically on Lake Winnebago in like May or June time usually around Father's Day, there's a big lake fly hatch, and these are bugs that look very similar to that fly at the top of the screen. Oh my gosh, panfish absolutely go nuts. If you catch a panfish during especially bluegill, if you catch bluegill during that week where the lake flies are crazy active, they're going to be like the ones you see on the slides for the most part. Like they're going to be stupidly fat, just super healthy, which is great to see for the fishery that they have food like that. But what I wanted to bring up was that flies, let's see if I have one. So again, the flies, it's gonna be a very similar story. Oh my gosh, if I walk this thing around, you guys are gonna barely see it. It's actually ridiculous. I will anyway, just because I want to make sure everybody sees this thing. Just gonna do a quick walk around. See how tiny that fly is? Some of you, if you have a fear of bugs, I'm sorry, because you might think I actually have a lake fly in my hand. Super tiny fly, just want to get the point across. Again, like I know on the slides you can see the thing, but it's really hard to get like an idea of what it is and how big it is just up on the screen. Super tiny fly, try and keep it to a brown color. My dad here actually ties them for me. What a nice guy, right? So these things are really nice. They're really tiny little fly. Super effective when you're fishing, again, shallow water. It's, you're not, I guess in my experience, again, that's something I like to remind myself to say. In my experience, because there's always exceptions. In my experience, I have not had much success with flies in deep water. Usually the fish aren't going to come up super high in the deep water unless they're suspended up high. But for the most part, these things, if I'm in like, 1 to, again, 6 feet of water, see that? Isn't that crazy? Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, so anything super shallow is where I'm gonna be using something like that. And it's a floating fly for the most part. So with the fly rod, I won't do a demonstration because I'm not the best fly angler by any means. That's a great question. Hey Dad, do you know what size cook these are? 12 or 14. Thank you, appreciate that, my fly fishing connoisseur. So yeah, for these things, you really want to have a really small fly because lake flies are not that big. And you want a floating one because when you see lake flies or any kind of insect like that, when you see something like that land on the surface, if they're on there for more than like 3 to 5 seconds, they're getting eaten by a big hungry bluegill, which is awesome as a fisherman because that means you just have to put a fly on the surface and you're probably gonna get bit. Big thing with that too, which I'll talk about later a bit more too. I could go on for hours on this, by the way, so if you think I'm covering a subject way too much, please just tell me, please, I beg of you, and everyone in this room agrees. So, other thing too to keep in mind with bluegill, they love weeds. They love shallow weeds. They eat all the insects that live in the weeds, and they love hanging out in the weeds. If there's anything you learn from today, fish the shallow weeds if you want bluegill. That is 90% of the time, that's where I catch my shallow bluegill. So that's a good place to find the bluegill, and then if you put a fly on top of them, you're just putting yourself up for success. So I would highly recommend that strategy, especially if you're fishing pressured bodies water. Sometimes they're sick of seeing the same old bobber approach. Sometimes I've even seen fish get spooked by bobbers when they hit the water. So fly fishing is a very effective technique that's quiet, and you're not gonna spook as many fish. Deep water. All right, how many of you would say that you've ever fished for panfish in, let's say, greater than 12 feet of water? Good, it's like probably half of you, good. So for those of you who haven't, I would say in my experience, when I first started thinking about catching bluegill in deep water and just panfish in general, it was very much like a, wait a minute, they go to deep water? Like I had only just grown up knowing, okay, there's bluegill and panfish up shallow, that's where everybody fishes for them. It's kind of weird that they'd be out there. So when I say deep water, I'm talking anywhere from like, again, shallow water is like probably max out like 6 feet for those techniques. I'd say anything from like 8 to 30 something feet is probably what I've fished in. You can catch panfish deeper than that. Other problem you run into, somewhat controversial, if you start catching fish in greater than 30 feet of water, they have bear trauma. When they come up, they're basically their air bladder and their guts come up, and that leads to very high mortality rates. So you don't want to be, in my opinion, you don't want to be fishing in that crazy deep water if you're not planning to keep every single fish you catch. So there's some nice bluegill, and I will talk about more than just bluegill. A lot of this stuff is applicable just in situations where there's all kinds of panfish up shallow, not just bluegill. Bluegill just, in my opinion, they're one of my favorite fish to catch because they fight so hard. If you've, I mean, many of you have caught them before. If they're bigger, you know, you start reeling into them, and then they just start turning away, and their side catches the water. It's awesome. If you haven't done it yet, please go try it. It's a blast. So in that middle picture too, I don't have a separate slide on spoons, but just really quick, one other technique I started using the last 2 years, jigging spoons like Castmasters, either rattling ones or non-rattling. They've worked really well when I've had a bobber set up in deep water bobbers, and I'm just jigging next to the boat because I'm not very patient. I don't want to keep watching bobbers all day. So I'll just jig next to the boat, and sometimes you get a few big bluegill coming in that'll hit that. They do have to be bigger to hit those spoons. You're not really going to catch small bluegill on them. It's a bigger meal for them. Jigging wraps, oh my gosh. Where do I begin? Okay, I'm doing another walk. I'm sorry in advance. Do another lap around the room. So I actually brought the larger jigging wrap sizes, just in case people don't know what jigging wraps are, they can get a better idea of what they are, what they look like. Just a minnow looking bait, really thin on the back, in case you haven't seen it before. Especially if you haven't seen these things before, please raise your hand so I make sure I show it to you. I feel bad if I'm missing anybody. Point is, when you jig this thing up and down, as you jig it up, it'll dart around in a circle. If you've never seen that video or you're curious about it, just look up a video of a jigging wrap in the water. It just swims up, and it darts around in a circle, looks like a wounded minnow. That is how fishing lures even began being invented, is the whole wounded minnow idea, and big fish like eating small fish. So, a bluegill, now, unless it's like some record from the southern part of the United States, that's some like 15-inch bluegill, for the most part, they're not gonna hit something this big. Their mouths cannot get around this. That's why we downsized. So a jigging wrap this size, like, let me remind you, one of you might win today. Well, one of you is going to win. I think 4 of you are going to win some. But they have a really small hook on them in comparison. They're a much, much smaller bait. This one is the 3/7 1.5 inch. I would say for bluegill, do not go bigger than 1.5 inch for jigging wraps. Like the hook gets too big, then you get fish that are hitting the head end but not the hook, or under the tail and they're not getting the hook. So I would say if you're gonna go for bluegill especially, go with either this 1.5 inch or drop down even to the, I think it's just an inch model. It's either that or a 1/2 inch. Regardless, it's a lot smaller. And that smaller one is even more effective. You can get bluegill that completely inhale that one because it's so much smaller. Like I said, if anybody really wants to see this, just put your hand, just put your hand up if you haven't seen these before. If you haven't seen them before, it makes a lot more sense once you've seen them. Anybody else need to see it? I didn't hit that side of the room. Y'all look pretty content over there. Yep, this is for deeper water. Yep, so I'm very much how can I spread my money the furthest? So as far as fishing goes, so like you can see in that picture right there, that's the same rod I have up front. I mean, I will use that kind of rod for bobbers, I'll use it for jigging, these kinds of things. It really doesn't matter. The big thing is that it's a very sensitive rod, and once you slap braided line on there, that's the big reason I have braid is for these baits. Because if you don't have braid, if you've used mono before for vertical jigging, you just won't feel as many bites. The braid is nice, there's no stretch in it. If you've never used braid before, there's no stretch. And so when you get a bite, it's an instant feedback into the rod. If you have mono and there's stretch, a lot of time they might hit it and you might feel it like a half a second late or a second late, and you'll just miss a lot of fish doing that. Gosh, I can't wait to see you guys go home with these jig wraps and catch fish with them. I'm so excited for that. Yes, good question. So for the bobbers, like I said, like 2 to 3 pound floor is usually what I go with. Jigging wraps, completely different story. I go all the way up to like 10 or 12 pound mono. So the reason for that, I know it might sound excessive for panfish. It's really just because of the amount of game fish that I run into with jigging wraps. I get so many bonus like bass, pike, walleye on these jigging wraps. And I'm a person where if I hook a fish, I want to land it, as I'm sure many of you understand. It sucks to lose a fish, doesn't matter what it is. It really sucks to lose a fish. So I usually bump up to like 10 pound leader. I haven't, gosh, I gotta knock on some wood saying this. I don't even know if that's wood. I have not lost a fish yet on a jigging wrap because of the 10 pound mono, like any game fish or anything. I haven't lost them yet on that. So I would say 10 is a pretty safe bet. I mean, the panfish, you're gonna feel bad. You're gonna be whipping the panfish into the boat so fast with 10 pound mono and 10 pound braid. But trust me, it is worth it for when you bump into anything like a pike or a walleye or anything like that that might have teeth, especially. Because that 3 pound fluoro, 2 pound especially, if you don't have your drag set perfectly, it will snap if you set the hook too hard. Any questions on jigging wraps? Because that is a topic I can go on to for hours and hours. Yep. Good question. Both on this and the shallow water casting stuff, I do use a barrel swivel for 2 reasons. One, especially for the jigging wraps, so like I said, those things are darting around sort of in a circle, and if you do that long enough, there's times where sometimes the line will start to twist up, and then the jigging wrap's like spinning in a circle. Trust me, fish don't like it when their fellow tiny fish are spinning like this. It doesn't look right. So I'll put a barrel swivel on there, and all that does is it just separates the connection between the main line and the leader, so that swivel will do the spinning, and then the bait below it won't spin. So good question. And I do that the same thing with the jigs too, because you don't want your jig spinning in a circle, and the swivel often helps to reduce that. Again, it's the same deal. Like there's this tiny little jig just spinning at 1,000,000 miles an hour. It doesn't look natural, believe it or not. Did you have a question too about jigging wraps? Perch, I would say, the question was how effective is it with perch? Have you used them ice fishing before? Okay. Ice fishing, now the seminar is not meant to be about ice fishing. If you've never used a jigging wrap for perch ice fishing, you're missing out. They look like a small minnow. Rather than buying minnows, you can just use a jigging wrap. They're ridiculously effective. Same thing applies. I think I have a picture up here somewhere of a piled perch. Is it up next? No. Come back to that. You'll see a picture of some perch at one point that were all on jigging wraps, that when you find the perch in the deep water, that's the problem. Is a lot of the time they're in shallower water, especially on the Mississippi, so you're not going to use the jigging wraps there. You could, but I don't. In my experience, it's if I find them in, let's say, I'm going to show you a spot later too. That's an example of this. That spot right there, there's a deep hole off of a current break where the perch were just stacked in, and it was like perch after perch after perch. Again, they love eating minnows just like any other fish does. So that's, yeah, it's a great bait for perch. I wish I had more pictures of perch because it's a really effective bait for those. Any other questions about jigging wraps before I move on? Any other questions? Yeah. Thank you. That is a super important point that I would have missed if you hadn't brought that up. So, let me find a picture on there. So, if you look over at the slide there, you'll see that right in the bluegill's mouth, you see how the bait doesn't really look like it's attached? Like it's kind of hanging off the side. Same with the crappie. On there, you can't tell. That, I don't know if you can see it, that little white thing that's hanging off the bottom of the jigging wrap on my rod there, that little white thing hanging down, all it is, it's a little plastic waxworm. It's not a real waxworm because real waxworms, they get ripped off easily. I don't like bothering with those. But if you just put like a little plastic thing on the bottom of the jigging wrap, I don't know what the reasoning is, but if you put that on there, the fish are so much more likely to go up and grab that hook. Because again, the issue is that if you don't have it on there, sometimes, especially with the size 3, the 1.5 inch jigging wrap, what you'll have is you'll have the fish, bring this for demonstration, they'll either hit the head end and they'll be coming up from the bottom. That's another important point I should make, but I'll come back to that. They'll hit it from the head or they'll hit it from the tail and they won't come up and hit the hook. Another important thing about the technique of jigging wraps is you always want to be trying to keep them above the fish, especially for panfish. For walleye and bigger fish like that, it's not a big deal. Usually they'll just come in and whack it and inhale the bait. But with things like panfish where you're really hoping that they hit that treble hook, especially bluegill, you want to keep it up high above them. That way when they come up for it, they see that hook, especially with the plastic on it, and they hit that. So if you don't have the plastic on there, I would say you're probably going to catch less bluegill. Perch, same story, like they'll usually inhale a jigging wrap if they're big enough for it. Like anything over 11 inches is going to have no problem inhaling a jigging wrap. And then crappie too, like, I mean, you can see the plastics on there, like it hit the plastics, but still, those things will inhale a jigging wrap completely if they want to. Any other questions about that presentation for deep water? Yeah. Yeah. Awesome question. Thank you for bringing that up, because that's, like I said at the beginning of the seminar, it's awesome to have a bait that works to catch fish, but if you don't know how to use it, completely useless. I've been in that boat before. Get the fish boat pun? Come on, really? Thank you, I appreciate that. So, I'll use this, I should get up on the stage so more people can see this, that way I don't have to keep doing a marathon around the room. So, everybody see? Yeah, you can see. So, when I'm using a jigging wrap, just pretend it's on the end because I don't have it tied on right now. It's very much what I would call a snappy cadence. All you're doing is you're snapping it, and like I said, as you pop it up, the bait is circling back down. So you want to pop it up, pull it away from the fish, and then drop your rod right away, because then it'll circle back down. And 90% of the bites I get are when the bait has finished circling down. It's like as soon as it circles down, comes to a pause, right before you're about to jig it again, you feel a thump, and then you get to set the hook, and that's a blast. I can't wait for you to try that. Anyway, yeah, I would say you kind of have to play around with it a bit too. There's some days where like they want to keep on moving constantly and then you pause and then they hit. Other days it's like they just want like a little hop. That's another thing you can play around with, is how big of a pull do you make? Because sometimes if you make a big sweep up like that and drop it down, sometimes it's just too much for them. Especially if like a cold front moves in. Yeah.
Do you ever use kind of bait on the
I have to think about that. Question was, have I ever used cut bait on the hooks? Are you talking like minnows included, or just?
or just pieces of an oily
Right.
or something?
So I think I've used pieces of fish before, like pieces of minnows and things like that. For me, the way I think of it is, it doesn't really look all that natural for a fish to have another fish head hanging off it. Let's say I use the head of a minnow. It doesn't really look that right for a minnow head to be hanging off of another fish. So for the most part, I don't tend to do that. I've done it before and it's worked for me, but I would say I've had my most success with these jigging wraps either a completely bare hook, nothing on the bottom, again, like for perch and crappie, or with bluegill if I put like a little piece of like fake wax worm on there or something like that. That's probably the most successful I've been. Again, I've tried even ice fishing too. I've tried putting meat on there, as they say, like minnow head or anything like that, and it just hasn't been that effective for me. So again, in my experience, I would stay away from it. I have not, but that's a cool idea. You're just saying like on that bottom hook again? Yeah, I have not tried that. Question was, have you used a jigging wrap with leeches before? And I have not, but thank you for that. Now I have an excuse to go fishing.
You know, what time of year do you go to this type of
Sorry, what's that?
What time of year do you go to this presentation?
All of them. And I'm not kidding when I say that.
After the spawn, pretty much, as they start running out for water.
Good point, yes, about the spawn. So in case you don't know, usually panfish do move up shallow for the spawn. So again, that's where I would be throwing something like those jigs and plastics, something like a fly rod, things like that. But once they're out in deeper water, for the most part, like after the spawn, pretty much any time other than like right in that spawn window, that's when I'm gonna be out in deeper water using the jigging wraps. Well, I'll come back to the example later, but I'll get back to that. Any other questions about that? It's always amazing for me because as I've used the jigging wrap, It's been like one of my favorite baits ever, and I'm amazed when people tell me they haven't used it before. I'm like, it catches all kinds of fish. This is not an ad, by the way. I want to make that very clear. Like, it catches all kinds of fish, and all you have to do is just downsize it for smaller kinds of fish, upsize it for bigger fish. It's not super complicated. Yeah.
Have you tried it in shallow? Not super shallow, but because, you know, shallow sometimes they're not biting, and you're like, you know what? Like 5 feet.
Yep.
Or using a slip rubber or taking
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, have you ever used the jigging Wrap in shallow water? The answer is yes, I absolutely have. I have many times. The issue you run into is with a jigging Wrap, you're going to be vertically jigging. I didn't make that super clear, but it's not usually going to be on a bobber, though I do like that idea of putting on like a heavier bobber and jigging up and down. Yeah, jigging up and down, yeah. For the most part, I'm just vertically jigging it next to either my kayak on the Mississippi River or my boat on Lake Winnebago. I usually do one of those two things, vertically jigging it, like again, right next to the boat. I mean, if you bring out a 14-foot pole, you can get it further away from the boat. But again, for the most part, I'm using a 7-foot rod, so it's right next to the boat. But the reason I bring that up is because in the shallow water, a lot of the time the issue you get then is that fish are going to have to come really close to the boat. And if you fish in shallow water before you know, especially on pressured bodies of water, fish are very spooky in shallow water because they can hear every noise you make above the water, especially if you're walking around in a boat, making noise, landing the fish. It makes a good amount of noise. So I've used them in shallow water before, and I have caught fish doing it. It's just not the most effective. But I do like what you brought up about how when they aren't necessarily hitting the bobber rigs you're throwing out, you can try something different, and especially if it's perch. Perch, in my experience, usually don't come up that high off the bottom. Usually I'm gonna keep getting perch like a foot or two off the bottom at the most. So if you're curious if there's perch around, I would absolutely drop a jigging Wrap down next to the boat and just try it. Perch also, I don't know about you guys, but in my experience, they're really not that spooky of a fish. Like bluegills spook all the time. Perch, I mean, they can be right next to you and they just don't care. I think they're just a more aggressive panfish. That's a good question. I'm honestly amazed it took that long to get that question. Most people love to know the hot color. So as I was walking around, I showed you the small example and the big example. Oh, I don't want to break anything. This is my first time at this expo. I don't want to damage anything, so that's a close call. So anybody who has fished with me when I'm using jigging Wraps knows that clown is like, I can't say enough. Now, it might just be biased because I use the color so much. Maybe that's just why I catch fish on it, because the more you use a bait, the more you're going to catch fish with it. Clown, for me, it's not so much about the green on the back. It's really not so much about that. It's more so about the fact that if you look at the underside, it's all chrome. Looks just like a minnow, flashes like a minnow. So again, when you're keeping the bait up above them, they're not even going to see the green. So I know people might say, oh, I love clown with that green and red head on it. Like, it's cool, it works, but for me, it's really just about the fact that it's silver on the bottom and fish are coming up high to see the bait. And that's why even the other, so I brought two in chrome. So this is just the silver again on the bottom with a black back, and then I brought 2 in clown to give away as well. But again, the whole point is just that there's chrome on the bottom. Chrome looks like a minnow. It's that simple. It really is. Great question though. Again, I'm amazed it took that long. Usually people love to know the hot color. Any other questions before I get into bobber rigs? Yeah.
When you're using that size of jigging Wrap, what kind of length and action rod are you using?
Yeah, let me actually read it off the rod because I'm curious what it says. So my general suggestion when you're using jigging Wraps on a rod like this would be light or medium light. I would not go ultralight. Ultralight, you just get into those like more floppy rods that like they don't give you the snap you need. You want a bit stiffer rod just so you can impart that snappy action. If you get a floppier one, it's gonna be more of like a pull than a snap. And I have noticed a big difference. I used to use them on like ugly sticks and things like that all the time. But this rod, I know it's a medium light. So this is a 7-foot medium light, fast action, I think extra fast action. So I would say, the problem is when you get into different rod brands, each brand markets their rods a little differently, as you know. So like some might call this rod a fast action, some might call this rod a fast action. For the most part though, I would just go with like a 7, maybe even 7'6" at the most, just so you can get a little further away from the boat. Like 7'6", light, medium light. Again, I wouldn't go medium. Medium, the other problem you run into is it's such a stiff rod and heavy rod that sometimes you're just not gonna feel the bites. Because especially bluegill, they'll come up and you'll just feel a tap on the rod. And if you have a lighter rod, you're gonna be able to set the hook quick. But if you have a heavier rod, you might say, Was that a fish? I'm not sure. Yeah.
I get it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes. So the question was, have you ever used ice fishing rods on the boat for using jigging Raps? I have, because that's how this all started. Actually, the jigging Rap thing is I said, well, late fall, it's close enough to ice. I should just bring the ice rod out and start using a jigging Rap. It works. Only reason I don't do it is just because, again, I want to get it further away from the boat. If it's right next to the boat, I mean, you're really relying on being quiet and not having it get, like, having the fish get spooked. So for the most part, plus, if you run into a bigger fish, those ice rods are a lot tougher to fight those big fish on. It is fun. I will agree with that. Absolutely. Yeah.
Trouble on the bottom, I know like the water fishing, sometimes you're losing them and
Yeah, so the question was that treble hook that's on the bottom, walleye fishing. I have heard of that commonly where people will upgrade the treble hook on the bottom because it's either coming off or it's breaking. I don't really know. I haven't done it before. I'm not really sure why. But the question was, do you do anything with these jigging Raps? I don't. I think maybe once a hook came off of the jigging Rap, and it's not a completely closed like fastener at the bottom. So like, it's tough because it's closed enough where it's usually not going to come off. I mean, you really have to like work at it to get it off. But over time, if you're setting the hook on a lot of fish, it could come off. So I would say, if anything, maybe just like use some pliers and squeeze it shut a little bit.
I was just keeping them thin.
Yeah, right. I will say I've never.
But a lot of times you put the jigging Raps.
Right. Yeah, I would say for panfish especially, never had an issue with fish coming off, ever. Partly because I'm using 10-pound braid. Like, I'm setting the hook pretty hard, and that hook is getting driven into them pretty hard, especially for a panfish. Usually, in fact, I will say pretty confidently, I don't think I've ever lost a fish because it's just like spit the jig. If they hit and they stick, they're coming into the boat. Yeah.
Question about, I think you do a lot of fishing on Winnebago.
Yep. I like the shirt, by the way.
Thank you very much. In springtime, when the bluegill comes, it's like hot stuff.
Yep.
It's pretty easy to do.
Yeah.
Where do they go? I mean,
After?
You go up through perch out in the summertime
Yeah.
out there, it's great on perch and
Yeah.
walleye and everything. Really hard to find, I mean, it's a big body of water, it's not like there's a Fox Lake or
Right.
a Speedway or something like
Yep.
that. It's like the bluegill completely disappear on it. If you do pick them up.
Oh, I love this question. Oh, I'm so excited for this question. I totally feel you here. I totally get what you're saying. So the question was on bodies of water, specifically Lake Winnebago. How many of you, by the way, fish Lake Winnebago? Like pretty consistently. Love to see that. So Lake Winnebago, in case you aren't familiar, huge body of water, biggest inland lake in Wisconsin. So it's funny that you say that because this last summer, I was hardly catching perch out in the deep water. All I was catching were bluegill. Yes. So it's funny you say that, and I will go into that I have to kind of keep things moving here. I will show that in the locations, and I'll show you where I was fishing and like why the fish were there. Again, like I said, I can talk for hours about jigging Raps. I will have time for questions at the end. You can come up and talk to me about it if you have other questions about it. I know it's a big scary room. It can be tough to ask questions sometimes. But we get to keep moving, unfortunately. They only gave me an hour. It's sad. Just go to the Expo office after the show and say, please give him an extra 15. Some of you might be saying, no, don't give him an extra 15. Too much. Okay, bobber rigs. This actually is directly related to your question. So I showed you guys the other bobbers, tiny little thing, right? Tiny little bobber. The next bobber is going to be a bit bigger. And I'm going to be using a bit different rig on it. So don't get fooled though, it's still a very, very light bobber, but it is, yep, it's a slip bobber. It is much larger than that other bobber. And so the way I run this bobber rig, everybody see that? Everybody see that bobber? Perfect. Let's see, I'm gonna give you the actual number. So this is a size 6 Aberdeen hook, I must add. It's just your typical worm on a hook. It is not complicated. Everybody has done this before. Just your typical, I'm a kid, I want to catch some bluegill, or I'm an adult, I want to catch some bluegill in Lake Winnebago. I want to catch some bluegill, and here's the worm rig I'm going to use. It's just a classic hook with a worm on it. It's that simple. Light wire? Yeah. Yep. Very, very thin hook. That's the only complaint I have about fishing this way, is that sometimes you'll hook like bigger fish like a bass. Like I get smallmouth bass on the lake all the time on those worms, and they bend the hooks out so bad. Even if my drag is loose, they bend them out. So I want to go into detail on the rigging, but honestly, more important, it's slip bobber. You've used slip bobbers before, I'm sure. Use a slip bobber. If you're not getting many bites though, all I can say is just downsize your bobber. Because sometimes you'll be getting bites and not know it, and you'll pull up your rig and there'll be no worm left. Just because your bobber's too big, it's not sensitive enough, you're not seeing the bite. Does that sort of answer the rigging at least? Yeah, I'll answer the location next. Yeah, do you have a question? I've heard of those, yeah. Yeah. I don't know, should I share that with everyone? I don't know if I want to repeat that. Yeah, I'm not, okay, I won't repeat that. just a secret technique that was just revealed. So ask him after the show, don't ask me, ask him. All right, so that's enough about bobber rigging. As you can see, it's very effective. So this right here, this is a video of me bobber fishing on Lake Winnebago. Now, the background is intentionally not shown because I don't want you showing up to my spot, but, so I actually want to rewind this real quick. Let's see if I can figure out how to do that. Okay, so just wait. Once I put this rod down, watch what I do with the next rod. This is something extremely important. I open up the bail and I let line out. Can I pause this? I don't know if that's possible. Okay, I'm setting a hook on a bluegill. You can watch a bluegill be caught on a bobber rig. Okay, what I did there is, if I can teach you anything today, this made the biggest difference in my bluegill fishing specifically last year. So the problem you get when you're in a boat, especially if you have an anchor out and your boat's, let's say, drifting side to side, what will happen is your bobbers will be out, right? As the boat drifts this way, this line gets pulled. As you drift this way, this line gets pulled. When my lines were tight and the bobbers were being dragged along, I was not getting bit at all, unless it was sheephead. I did get a few sheephead, but that's not necessarily a skill. So as soon as I would open the bail, let line out, and when you let the slack out, the bobber stops moving, because again, it's just simple. It's not being dragged by the boat because there's more line for it to move. So when you let the line out, the bobber will sit completely still. The more slack I gave them, like, I'm not kidding, I would leave like so much slack out where when I saw a bobber go down, I would have to run over the rod and like, okay, come on, yeah. So I would say, especially for bluegill, perch don't seem to care as much either. They'll pretty much just come up and hit if it's a worm. But with the bluegill especially, I've noticed, especially in summer when I'm using those deep water bobber rigs, it applies shallow too, but especially in deep water, you want it sitting basically dead still. The little waves you see in that video, they're doing the job of basically jigging the bait up and down. It's tough to fish in the super wavy conditions for bluegill like that because it's moving the bait 5 feet in the air at a time. It's kind of ridiculous. Again, it doesn't look too natural. I want to move on to locations quick because I don't have much time left. Lake Winnebago. Look at that. We're going to answer your question already. So this is a shallow water example. I actually have a laser pointer. So I included Navionics. If you have never used it before, all it is just lake contour lines that are mapped out by boats as they go along. So this is the Google Maps satellite view, and it's kind of tough to see on screen. Basically, there's some super shallow weeds here that come up almost to the surface right in the middle of your screen on the right. I'm gonna make my way over here so you guys can see what I'm talking about. So right in the middle there's some really shallow, super shallow weeds you can see from the map view that, like, they're almost to the surface. That's not where I usually catch my fish in the spring especially. Usually it's gonna be in the slightly deeper section. On the sides you can see it's a bit darker water. Usually it's gonna be on the sides where it's a bit deeper. There's still weeds there, but they're more submerged and the fish are just cruising right along the tops of them. That's, in my experience, that's what's been most effective for me. And I'm showing you these examples not as like, okay, go fish there, because I mean, you know, you can, I'm not gonna be too upset. It would suck if like 100 people went to fish there, but whatever. The more the merrier, right? But I just give this as an example of like, here's something to look for. Look for a weed bed, but then fish like the outside edge of it, especially in that shallow water, but I will show deep water as well. And this is another, honestly, this is very similar. I can probably see with this. How am I doing on time? What time is there? All right, yeah, we'll keep it going. So this is just another example. Super shallow up here, there's some docks, super shallow weeds, a little bit deeper. And I'm gonna get into mapping tools in a bit here quick too. Just about, like, I used Google Maps again to find this, and that's how I even found the spot, was I said, oh, there's some shallow weeds, and there's a little bit of a drop off. I should fish that drop off. Sometimes you'll get fish way up in the shallow weeds, especially when the water's still cold, when the weeds are just starting, but for the most part, try to stay in those submerged weeds. Mississippi River, who's fished it? Nice. So this is one of those perch fishes I was talking about. Who asked about the perch? Perfect. Yeah, so I use jigging Wraps all the time out there, and the spot I'm gonna show you, which is that spot, I was fishing for my kayak, just vertically jigging right next to the kayak, super effective. Just, I love it, it's awesome. And then panfish as well, super shallow, as you can see by the fact that I'm on a sandbar right now. So this is that spot that I'm gonna show you for perch. So I've made sort of a, I'm not very artistic, so sort of a decently pieced together map. The line, it's pretty straightforward. The line is the current flow in the river, north to south, and then that little rock barrier right there is just a man-made barrier. I'm not really sure why it's there. And then the current flow is going this way. The rock barrier pretty much just stops the current, and then it circles, actually doesn't circle right there. It just keeps going straight down the river. That rock bar prevents it from looping in. So in those deep holes right there, that 25 feet in there, those blue marks are my fish catching marks. Okay, so if you're gonna go there, just stay away from those. You can have all the other fish, just stay away from those marks, all right? You better have your GPSs out. So that, again, those deep holes right there, that's where I have my most success. Not as many bluegill in those super deep holes. I would say more of my success on the river there has been either way shallow or in that spot, but in like that little gap right there, that's like 15 feet, and I've done better there. It's more so the perch and crappie that I get in the really deep holes. And this is still on the Mississippi River, never mind. So yeah, this is the Mississippi River as well. This is a great example, like I said, of both deep and shallow panfish. So there's docks here, there's weeds here, super deep hole right here. Just wanna make sure you guys can see that too. I mean, you can read, but still. Dock, weeds, deep hole. So pretty much for this spot, I've caught a lot of perch in this hole as well as crappie. Then as soon as I move up shallow to like this weed bed right here, and that weed bed grows throughout the summer too, but in that weed bed where that grows and the docks, that's where I tend to catch a lot of my bluegill too. Lake Monona, who's fished it? I love asking this question, it's great. Awesome. So this is actually my first time fishing it this past summer, but I said, well, I'm gonna try my jigging Wraps. So I did. So every single Lake Monona fish was on a jigging Wrap. There were a lot of others besides this, but I only have so many places to put pictures, but you'll just have to believe me, or just ask me to see pictures, just to see my pictures. I will show you so many fish pictures. Please don't ever ask. Huh? Do you really? I mean, the big background in the back is pretty helpful, you know? That's good. Yeah, you guys can go to that one anytime. Go to that spot. It's pretty obvious where it's at. So it was just, I wanted to get a photogenic picture, you know? Anyway. So this is a spot on Lake Monona. I think it is that second picture. So shallow weeds, shallow docks. We really didn't catch anything up in the weeds. I think this was like July or August. So this was the dead heat of the summer. Almost all of our fish were in this like what I'd call mid-depth range. So that light blue stuff, the dark blue is super shallow, white's the super deep, that's like 40 something feet. This mid-depth range was anywhere from like 12 to 18 feet. Tons of bluegill just stacked up there. The whole reason they were stacked up there now, there was a weed edge in the like shallow water here. Weed edge in the shallow water along this line, okay? As soon as we got outside the weeds onto this medium depth area, it was nonstop fish. But now when we get to the super deep stuff, like 40 feet, really didn't catch much. And again, I try to avoid fishing that deep anyway. I don't really want to just kill every single fish I pull up. So I try to stay in that mid-depth range, and that's where we're having our most action. Yeah.
Are you drifting over that to find them, or you just see them on find or whatever?
Yeah. So I actually don't have any sonar in my boat. So most of what I do, that's also why jigging Wraps are effective, because I can just drop them down. If I catch fish, I catch fish. It's a good way to search and find fish. The question was, when you're like going over these spots, are you just drifting? Are you using your sonar to find fish? I usually will drift with jigging Wraps. They're so heavy that you can jig pretty fast, and they'll sink back down, especially if you're in that mid-depth water. Once you get to really deep water, it's tough to drift. Usually you want to set up in a spot and wait. Like that Mississippi River hole I showed, I'm trying to stay as still as possible in that, because if I'm like drifting too much, it's so deep you won't even feel the bite. All right, last thing here. The two mapping tools I used in this slideshow were Navionics, that was the map on the left, the contour map. Map on the right was satellite maps like Google Maps, Apple Maps. I don't care what you use, they're not paying me anything, but they should, so if you know anybody, let me know. Contour lines for Navionics, it is so helpful for someone who has no sonar on the boat, because I can know exactly how deep, or roughly how deep I'm fishing without having sonar. Sonar's great, but it's nice to know that I can look at the map and say, all right, tomorrow I'm going fishing at Lake Monona, let's check here, here, and here because of this. Again, I can see there's shallow weeds. Let's go check the mid-depth structure. Again, you can also put waypoints down. That's why I have those waypoints on there, so then I can come back to them a year later and say, oh, I caught fish here last year. Let's do it again. And that doesn't always work, trust me. I wish it did. Accurate GPS tracking. You can also just tell exactly where you're at on the map with that. Google Maps just isn't really that great at tracking your location. It's all right, but it's not like as accurate as I found as Navionics is. So the weed grow, that is the most effective thing for Google Maps and just satellite mapping for me. Like I showed in the last couple slides, I can see exactly where weeds were last year. I can see where they've been in your past. If you go online, you can even do like multiple years in the past and see over the years where the weeds are at, and that can show you where you can start fishing if you're trying to find fish in the weeds. There's more visible docks on Navionics. It sometimes doesn't show all the docks that are present. It's easier to find boat launches. Here's where you can find me. Like I said, some of you have probably seen me, Facebook, Instagram, things like that. But let's pull some tickets here. I want to see some people win some stuff. You guys have been very gracious in letting me talk at you about fishing for an hour. I really appreciate it. Let's get some people winning some stuff now. Who's excited? Oh yeah, there we go. My gosh, I say we're winning something. You're acting like you're going to a funeral. All right, let's get this thing started. So I've got 4 jigging wraps in that 1.5 inch size, so it's great for perch, crappie, bluegill, whatever. And then I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 packs of plastics. Those plastics I had on those jigs in the first couple slides, that's what I use. So let's I feel like I should shuffle these rather than just pull from a straight line. I'm just gonna, no, you know what I'll do? One of you guys can help me. Does that work? Do you guys want to pick a ticket? I'll have to get the security in case people want to hunt me down after this for not picking their ticket. Here, just pick from one of these strips, just pick one ticket off. Don't look for you. Oh, come on! Just pick a couple randomly, wherever. Here, pick another one. Just pick a bunch. Anywhere. Don't pick them right off the end. You gotta pick some mixed in there. Jeez. These kids these days. Oh, did you hear that? I heard somebody say they'd buy you ice cream if you picked their ticket. Oh, yep. That's weird. He's pointing himself out. That's kind of bad. I mean, yeah. If he wins, I'm not giving him a prize. Yeah. Right.
Fly fishing, you got such a small, okay, you know, a little pond, like,
Yeah. Honestly, I wish I could say it was that case, like where it's like we'll use the smaller ones for smaller ones, use the bigger ones for bigger ones. Some of the biggest bluegill I've ever hooked on a fly rod have been the tiniest flies I've ever hooked. So it's I wish I could do it that way because then obviously you can sort it out. But honestly, I usually just chuck the same piece of weeds or the same piece of like tree laying down that I use for the rod, and I just keep weeding. That's like just put the time in, and if there aren't any sizable fish, just put on it. You know, that's the best advice I can give. Oh boy, we got some tickets. Thank you guys so much for your help. Okay, first one. I'll just have you walk up here. Just meet me at the end here. 880-9560. Perfect. Yep, just walk right up there. Thank you. Here, follow me. Follow me, good sir. Thank you. Yep, come on up. Yeah, you're good. You're good. Here, I'll just have you wait. Actually, you just pick out of these jigging wraps and this pile of baits. Just pick one you want. Go for it. Thank you, sir. Oh no. Uh-oh. This guy's more of a pro than I am. All right, next one. Did you pick a good one? Oh, he picked a good one. 880-9575. Oh, way to go. Go ahead and pick whatever you'd like. One of these. What are you thinking? Jigging wrap or plastic? Good call. Good call. He listened. He picked the clown jigging wrap. Next up, 880-9576. Oh, look, wait a second. Shenanigans. Go ahead and pick one of those out there. Another clown jigging wrap taker. Good idea, good idea. Where are the rest of the tickets? Are you still all right? I'm gonna need some more tickets, gentlemen. You get me some more tickets. Thank you. Appreciate that. Right. 880-9552. 9552 at the end. forgot to mention too, if you have questions for me, I pretty much ran out of time. Oh, there we go. And this guy told me when he walked in, he said, I asked him, I said, are you feeling lucky today? And he said, nah, man, I'm not lucky. I don't win anything. Well, there you go. My goodness. What do we got? This one? All right. 880-9514. Oh, so close. All right, kids, pick the next one in that line. Oh, here we go. 9514, we got him. Yeah, as I was saying, just if you got questions, head on up at the end. I got time. They just won't let me talk any longer. Just come up at the end. Just come up at the end, please. This is priority right now. These kids, they are working hard. What do you got for me? What do you got for me? Ready? 880-9505. 9505 at the end. Who's got it? Oh no, we're going away from it? 9505. There you go. There you go. Got lots of plastics to choose from up there. No, not the rod. I wish I could use the rod. Hey! I need those things. Summer is not that far away. My goodness. Got another one for me? Pick a good one. Did you just read that to make sure it was your ticket? Oh, this guy's kind of sketchy. 880-9529. Look at that. You guys are so quick with reading. This is awesome. One of those plastics. The red ones are my favorite. All right, go for it. Yeah. 880-9541. 9541. 9541. 9541. Where are they going? This is not paid time off. This is not a lunch break. What do you got? You got it? Any of those? You got it. Where did that file come from? Are those all your tickets? I don't know. I don't believe that. 880-9557. 9557 at the end. Oh, less. Shenanigans. All right, we got it. Am I taking out of your pile now? I think it's his ticket. Any of those? You have to go for it. Aw, everybody say it with aw. 880-9504. 9504. Oh, look at that. Perfect. Got 3 choices left in the plastic department. Pick a good one. Smart man. All right, next one. Which one? Is that the one? 880-9559. Look at that. You guys are so good today. I can't say that enough. Sometimes it's just silence, waiting. Thank you. Thank you for being quick with this. They're gonna fire me for taking too long. Thank you. That was awesome. All right. One more we got? One more? 880-9525. And before you all leave, hold on one second. Like I said, if you have any questions, just come on up here at the end. Just want to say, can we just give a round of applause for these guys? Nice job. Good work. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it.